Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Eyes On. We got the full crew here: Andy Milburn, Jason Lyons, Mick Mulroy, and myself. Uh, Lot going on. First and foremost, the Gaza ceasefire is currently underway as we're shooting this right now, 12 o'clock Eastern on Sunday. Uh, what are you guys looking at, Mick? I know you've been tracking this pretty tight.
Yes, tracking it from both ABC perspective and the fact that my group is doing humanitarian aid in Gaza right now. So obviously, it's a great thing that we have a ceasefire that's now come into place. It was very tedious and tension ridden because neither side trusts each other at all. I mean, they're mortal enemies in the purest definition of the word. So there was some fits and starts. One of the biggest issues I think that's been revolving around these negotiations is the lack of clarity of who's alive and who's not. Right. Normally, when you do hostage negotiations, you start off with the proof of life, so you know what you're negotiating for. So it's still unclear to the Israeli side and the mediators, for that matter, out of the 97 that are still left, how many are still alive? And it's believed that even in the first 30, which is women, elderly, and children, that there are already going to be remains rather than people coming out. So where we are right now, the three females that Israeli hostages have been relieved. They have been checked by the Red Cross, and they're in the process of repatriation. At the same time, there's about 90 Palestinian prisoners, some of which were in prison for life. A couple actually committed significant terrorist acts that killed innocent civilians. They're in the process of being moved. And that's even more complicated. Where are they going? I'm not even sure where they are. I follow this pretty closely. Some may actually end up in out of the country. And Qatar and Egypt is what part of the chatter is. And then at this, all with all that going on, you have the IDF having to relocate from population centers, not all the way out, and there's supposed to be 600 trucks per day of humanitarian assistance, much needed, going into Gaza. 300 are supposed to go all the way to the north. So that is a logistical difficulty because of the damage to the infrastructure. And of course, a large portion of that is fuel that is needed for the hospitals to be able to get up and running, which is also very much needed. And this is all happening at the same time, and it's going to go day by day. Um, we should all hope that it continues to go without any disruption, but there's a big chance that there could be disruption because of this complicated manner. And of course, just to add to that, not everybody listens to Hamas. There's plenty of jihadists in there that might want to disrupt this for whatever reason. And if they can do something substantial enough, it's potential. So this is a very tenuous situation.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, well, Mick's the expert on this. I've just been reading some of the kind of the human interest side of the story too. One of the first three women is actually a British citizen, a dual national, and so the British papers have been going wild over this. And yeah, I mean, there's some quite touching coverage. Evidently, she has been a tower of strength as a hostage. Other hostages who were released have said that, and not simply because she's British, but Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, which I believe is, another football club, not one of the best.
They're pretty
Because
up there.
yeah, I'm joking. It's just for all the Spurs fans out there who are deplorable human beings. But aside from that, because she was a fan of Spurs, they've been releasing yellow balloons during their matches and making announcements, throughout the hostage crisis on her status, and good kudos to them. The other thing is, to Mick's point of the Palestinians being released. And I think this this plays into Sinwar's original calculus. Now, remember, when Sinwar was released from jail in 2011, it was part of a hostage release. And, there were 1,000, I believe, 1,000 Palestinians released in return for the body of Gilad Shalit. who was an Israeli soldier who'd been kidnapped and killed. And so Sinwar's calculus through all of this was partly based on his own experiences. Remember, we talked about Sinwar's time in an Israeli jail, how he studied through the British Open University courses on Israel, on the Zionism, but he's also a keen analyst of Israeli national psychology, speaks very fluent Hebrew. And so it's ironic, all this time later, a number of deaths later, since 15 months into it. And, his predictions are kind of coming true. I mean, listen, from a personal perspective, I'm for this ceasefire. I'm not criticizing it. But some of these high-profile prisoners being released are indeed high-profile. One is Zakaria Zubeidi, who's a senior member of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades on the West Bank. He'd escaped from a Gilboa prison back in 2021, was caught again, and he was behind a wave of bombings in Jerusalem. There's another prisoner also who's been held personally responsible for 42 deaths of civilians in bombing attacks back in the second Intifada. So again, this kind of plays into Netanyahu's stance on the hostages. In other words, his apparent unwillingness to negotiate and to any terms of ceasefire. And I'm not suggesting he's driven by principle. He's driven by trying to hold his coalition together. But it flies in the face of kind of the Israeli national ethos, which is regardless of cost to bring back their own, alive or dead. And it'll be interesting to see what happens to his coalition now that Ben-Gvir has finally quit. He's packed up his toys. Ben-Gvir represents the Jewish Power Party, and which is, of course, on the right wing. But it looks as though, because the consensus in favor of this ceasefire is I won't say it's universal, but it seems as though a majority of Israelis support it, and there have been parties and central on the center who have offered to help support Netanyahu's coalition in order to carry this through, which is an extraordinary, because Netanyahu is hated by these people. I mean, he's hated by a significant part of Israel. But the fact that they're willing to align with them in order to make this ceasefire deal go through just shows kind of the level of hope and expectation that a sizable chunk of the Israeli public places on this ceasefire and the return of the hostages.
So I wanted to ask, and I guess I'm not sure if either of you know this, but is it normal for that, I guess, what seems like a lopsided exchange, like the Israelis for like 300 of theirs? Is that normal?
In
with past
2011,
practice, yeah.
2011, I think it was, I forget how many it was for 1,000 prisoners, but it was I think it was like in the double digits.
Really?
Yeah, and it seems like the ratio this time is 30-1.
Okay.
Right. So there's 3 coming out today, and there's 90 being released. So, and some of them are, I think, out of the pool that might be released in total, over 1,000. There's about 190, 200 that have serious life sentence, like Andy was just talking about. These people that are. So it's causing some tension, of course, with the family members of the people that were killed. But ultimately, I think for the greater good, to get the people that there's the first 33 include children, for Christ's sake. It's I mean, I can see how the families of the ones that were killed in the past would be upset, but there's very difficult decisions to be made, and it's going to be even more difficult to go from phase 1 into phase 2, because phase 2 is a full withdrawal of IDF from Gaza, right? So that is a huge political decision that's going to be fraught with collapsings of governments, and it of course makes it more difficult if Hamas then decides to start fighting again, if they can regain the capacity, because after all, there was a ceasefire on October 6th, right? So, yeah. But right now, they're focused on getting through phase one and getting these 33 people out.
So can we break down a little bit of what the parameters of the ceasefire is? Like, is there a day count on it, like how they had in Lebanon versus Hezbollah and stuff like that? Like, what does it look like? The 33 hostages, obviously. Like, what's phase
Yeah,
1, 2?
it's 42 days, phase one, to get 33 hostages out when there's 30 Palestinian prisoners per hostage. I don't think the amount of truck aid going in changes. I think it's 600 a day, per day, every day. There is some withdrawal requirements for the IDF out of population centers, but what's another part of this? That's the ones I know. And then when you go into second phase, it's a full withdrawal, and then third phase, in generally speaking, is the reconstruction of Gaza, right? So, which is going to take decades. So, if you're looking at the overall strategy of Hamas, I heard this morning, which I thought was kind of interesting. Pre-October 7th, the economy of Gaza was essentially equal to Morocco, right? So there's this concept that it was an open prison and everything was without hope, but it wasn't actually the case, right? So Hamas, for their strategy, has completely devastated Gaza. It's about 85 to 90% uninhabitable structures. And I think I've seen an estimated 50 to 60 billion dollars in required to reconstruct, and it'll take 10 to 15 years. Right? So that's where they put their people.
Wow.
And 46,000 dead right now.
Mm.
What's the situation on the ground look like humanitarian wise?
It's very dire. I mean, we've all heard I don't think there's any functional hospital right now.
Mm.
Partly because there's no generators, there's no power. So the stuff that you need for any kind of advanced medical care is not there. The medicines, vaccinations have been a problem. So there's a concern that, otherwise diseases that would not be coming back are coming back. And of course, it's winter there. So there's a big problem with exposure and food. I mean, the food is just not flowing in, but it should now. And I think that from my understanding, and we were just talking to our team this morning, there's two things. They need to get the food in. They have to have a place to store it, right? Because if they don't, people are hoarding it, people are stealing it, people are then selling it, and the people who don't have money. So there has to be a rebuilding of some of the infrastructure that the UN specifically used to use to hold large food stores, to get them in there so it calms down the population. They can look over there and see that there's enough food for the next 2 months, so they don't need to fight each other for this bag of rice or attack the truck driver. This all needs to happen simultaneously so it can kind of decompress the situation, but also get food. Not just the other issue, and I know I'll get a little deep on this, but when they come into one particular ground entry point, it's very difficult to convince the population that it goes through first that they should let it go because there's a population further away than them. They're starving. It's kind of a situation where it's every man, woman for himself, kind of a Darwinian type thing. So they have to come in from different directions. I would say that there's still a need for a maritime corridor just to be done different than it was in the first place, because you can come in at different, including the north, and really bring in large scale humanitarian assistance to places that just aren't getting it because they can't get trucks there.
So Mick, with the speaking on humanitarian still, do you know, or do you think there might be a hesitation from humanitarian groups outside of the ones that are already set to do work there to come in because of past attacks on humanitarian, trucks and things like that?
Super risky, absolutely. They've proven that they still are willing to go and risk it all. I think one of the issues is there's a resistance on the side of humanitarian groups to fully coordinate with the IDF, which involves tracking, right? So most of us know that coordination across the battle space is super important, and you don't want to blow that off, because it's generally you that will pay the consequences, and that is what happened. I understand their issues, from their perspective on allowing themselves to be tracked, but that's one of the issues that leads to these deaths of humanitarian workers, for sure. But it's very dangerous to work there, and I think the more we can do to coordinate, potentially like a military level coordination of movement in a battle space, would be beneficial, not only to the individuals who are brave enough to go and serve this humanitarian purpose, but to get the aid to people, right? Because if everybody was confident that they wouldn't get attacked accidentally en route, then there would be more people willing to do it, right? So it benefits the people on the ground as well as the humanitarians that are brave enough to go there.
About a thing about the hostages, like you said, like there's possibility that there are multiple groups that are holding them, not just Hamas. Is Hamas like coordinating with them to try and get whoever, whatever hostage they have out? Because I remember when it first went off, we had Alex Blitzis on, and he said that there was real trouble, locating the hostages, because it's not just Hamas, not just one body. It's like multiple people that hold these people.
Yes.
So I'm assuming yeah, go ahead, please.
I think they believe a lot of them are being held by just families, right? In places that are the least likely to draw attention of, if they're around a lot of Hamas fighters, that is going to draw attention just from the sake of the battle, right? So that's one of the reasons why Hamas says they don't know how many people are still alive. They would have to send people around to places they believe the hostages are being held to make some kind of proof of life determination. So certainly not making excuses for them, but that is the difficulty of recovering these hostages. They're spread all over the place, and often in places that wouldn't be considered for where a hostage would be.
It's the internal. There's a couple of things that are going to be really interesting to watch play out. One is, as the Trump administration moves into position here, what their stance is going to be if the Israelis make the call that Hamas is not cooperating with the ceasefire, and that all bets are off, and that the IDF will go in and finish the task of destroying Hamas. Now, Netanyahu tells his colleagues, his right-wing colleagues, who are left, notably Smotrich, who represents the ultra-Orthodox MK, I think it's MK party. He's telling him, look, Hamas is going to break this deal, and everything's going to be fine, because then we'll go in and finish the task. This is just kind of a hiccup. But no one really knows what the Trump administration's status is on that. It does seem as though Trump wants this to end, and that it is an unnecessary distraction from what he sees. And I don't have any insights here. I'm just saying from what he and his foreign policy team see as being dealing with the real adversary, which is Iran, and moving forward on achieving some kind of a resolution there. But nevertheless, that's kind of what Netanyahu believes, and Smotrich called this week Netanyahu a lying son of a liar, which is an interesting juxtaposition of adjectives and nouns. And so he's hanging on by a thread, and something's been promised to him, because Netanyahu, at the same time, against his will, has started, he hasn't started, but the Israeli government has started to enforce the conscription of ultra-Orthodox Jews, and actually this week issued warrants for the arrest of those who are trying to evade conscription. This has been a live wire issue in Israeli politics for some time, and Netanyahu opposed it, and it was the Supreme Court that overruled, what the government's appeal, that this was not the government's attempts to block it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And so you can see Netanyahu is dancing he's he not to mix metaphors, but he is walking a tightrope here, trying to keep the right wing, trying to keep the ultra orthodox within his coalition, because those are his power base, rather than having to rely on centrist parties who will desert him probably as soon as the deal is over.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, Andy, with the this conscription, is that something that would still be in effect? Let's just say everything stopped today. The ceasefire held, there was no more fighting. Would that be something that would still be put into effect, or was that only because of what happened on October 7th?
No, October the 7th might have been a catalyst, the mass mobilization of all the reservists. I think probably made it very clearly apparent to a number of Israelis that the burden of military service was not being equally shared throughout the population. But this has been an issue that has been going on for at least 5 years, because as you guys probably know, the Haredi population have, under an understanding, I believe is going all the way back to Ben Gurion, when they were kind of imported into Israel from Eastern Europe after the war to keep the traditions of Jewish religion alive. The agreement back then was that they would not be called into service, but they have, they've grown, they've multiplied, and so now. It's very, when you have a large segment of the population who is not serving in the military, this isn't coming from me, it's coming from a lot of, Israeli friends, and their views are not really tangibly contributing to Israeli society in any other way. I mean, they continue the religion. Yes, they study it and they propagate it, but they're not defending the country, and they're not working in business that adds to the GDP. And so it doesn't, modern Israel doesn't accept this exemption in the way that that Ben Gurion intended it to be justified. So a lengthy answer, but yeah, this week, 1,000 ultra-Orthodox men received their draft. I'm sorry, not this week. It was months ago. It was back in last summer. It was in July. They received their draft notices, and now warrants are being issued for arrest. I don't know how many who are being classified as deserters, but it's apparently a significant portion of those 1,000 who are called up. And at the same time, the ultra-Orthodox parties, of which Smotrich is a representative, oppose this and have opposed it from the start.
Hey guys, it's Jack. I just wanted to talk to you today about a way that you can help support the podcast if you're not already. To support the channel is to become a Patreon member. So we have Patreon memberships that start at just $5 a month. And when you sign up, you get access to all of our episodes ad-free. That's the big bonus for that. I mean, we also do some Patreon bonus episodes for our subscribers. But this is the biggest and best way that you can support the Team House channel and podcast if you'd like to. And we really appreciate that. So go and check us out at patreon.com/theteamhouse.
Yeah. So you guys, Andy, you mentioned like the Trump administration's real aim in the region is Iran. And last week I saw a report where France, Germany, and the UK met with Iran to talk about whether it's options or what's going to happen if they do get hit in terms of like their nuclear capabilities. And like there was some speculation that Israel had a plan ready to go, and they're waiting for the Trump administration to come in, just because I'm assuming the Trump administration would probably be a bit more lenient, at least in the press. Where have you guys heard anything about that in terms of like where we're at like it sounds like it's just ready to go and they're just waiting to hit the button basically.
So there's been a plan, of course, by Israel for the day that they believe that Iran's in a breakout mode toward a deliverable nuclear weapon. I think it's important to point out that yes, they could get 4 four weapons, or at least enough material to make four weapons. But then they have to, and I'm not a nuclear bomb expert, but they have to come up with the triggering mechanisms to make it functional, right? And I've heard up in open source, I've heard up to a year that would take. But there is a plan, and I do believe it's being discussed more openly and more along the idea that it will happen if there's enough intelligence that indicates that's where it's heading. And I think the Biden administration was talking about it with Israel, and now the incoming administration was probably part of those conversations during this transition. And we'll see, but it could be that they're openly talking about it, or at least talking to media about it, because they want Iran to look at that and say, okay, we've had several strategic setbacks, right? We're out of Syria for the most part. We've seen Hezbollah and Hamas decimated. We've shown that we can't actually conventionally fight Israel, and we don't really have any air missile defense systems, as our S-300s have been destroyed by Israel. Maybe it's an opportunity to go back into negotiations for an agreement that President Trump would find acceptable, and that would likely include all the proxy operations, which wasn't included in the first agreement, the JCPOA, and which is why they got criticized. So this might be real in the sense that they are really looking at, how are we going to do this if we need to, but it also might be, at least in part, to really send a message to Iran, like, now's the time to try to come up with a new agreement, and it might be effective. They might come to the back of the table because they are not doing well economically. The regime is incredibly unpopular, and they've proven that they really don't have much bite to their bark. They're pretty much all bark, military.
I mean, I'm assuming here, and I'm speculating. Would Israel really want another deal, even if it involved proxy forces?
I don't think Israel
so.
cares. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, and just quickly, and then over to you, Andy. I think if you include the proxy forces, it would be a difficult discussion of the United States going, okay, so they don't get a nuke and they stop funding the proxy forces, and you're against it.
Right.
Right. So, like, what is it you want? I mean, do you want the conflict with Iran? I don't think that would be good for the region, right? Or you. So I think if you include that, it'll change the discussion. I'm sure there'll be some people there, but we have to focus on the majority because that's what counts.
Andy?
Yeah, no, I was going to say I don't think there's much room to maneuver if the Iranians do agree. Of course, they've got to convince the negotiating parties of a means to monitor this. But if the Iranians agree to stop in funding Hezbollah in particular, and of course Hamas, and from the U.S. perspective, the Houthis too. Then I think that'll keep all parties, Israel, Saudi Arabia, United States, happy. But it'll be interesting to see. Certainly, as Mick says, they're on the ropes, but that's such a central part of their foreign policy, right? Because that's how they exert influence. And for Quds Force, the IRGC, and Khomeini himself to kind of give up on that is almost unimaginable. Propagation overseas of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the destruction of Israel have been, it's been an open strategy of Iran. It was a shared strategy with its proxies to step back from that. Is going to be a tough call on their part, and perhaps the threat of a strike on their nuclear program is the only thing that'll bring them to it.
All right, going back to the ceasefire for a second. I want a little bit of speculation from you guys. Does it hold? Did we get to the 40? Not even hold. Does it get to the 42 days?
So I think it's in both sides' interest to get to the end of the 42 days, if it's done by the letter of the agreement. So part of it's just hopeful optimism, but I think there's a good chance. After that, it's really tough because I mean, if you were in Israel's shoes, you're going to withdraw the IDF. Who's filling the security vacuum, right? So, my understanding, and I've been here talking to a lot of folks about policy stuff and also what we're doing overseas. My understanding is the U.S. has gone to Gulf allies and talked about a multinational security force that could potentially bridge the gap between, obviously not Hamas and something that's Palestinian but not Hamas. And they've all said, hell no, right? So then who's going to fill the security vacuum? And there's for practical reasons, that's a tough answer and a tough decision to make. Then is it going to be a private company? Is it going to be at multiple private companies? And what would be acceptable? What kind of outside are they going to train Palestinians? I mean, that all has to happen before we go into the second phase, or there's no security that the Israelis would be comfortable with. So I don't want to say we will not get into the second phase because that just seems defeatist. But the challenges are very real, and it's hard to see that unless the international community, which says a lot and does little, steps up in some capacity, there will be a very difficult decision for the IDF to pull the IDF out.
Yeah, especially since all these prisoners have just been released, to include 200 with who are serving multiple life sentences each. So yes, Hamas's leadership has been destroyed, but Hamas has not been destroyed, and that's clearly evident in some of the film that we're seeing, some of the video clips of Hamas fighters driving through Khan Yunis and being cheered by the crowds. And of course that's predictable. You can't destroy an organization like Hamas by just whack-a-mole, by sheer destruction. I mean, that's not the way to go about it. We've talked about this over and over, and who knows how many nascent Hamas fighters they have created in by doing that. If you've seen your whole family killed by the Israelis, you might have been a fence sitter before, but I think anyone here on this video call and most of our audience would probably want to pick up a gun and get vengeance, because that's human nature. And now you've got all these embryo leaders returning to the fray. It just doesn't it doesn't bode well. The destruction of Hamas was always just an empty phrase, and I don't think Israel is any nearer now than it ever was to doing that.
Yikes. I mean, so I have to completely agree with you, Andy. 42 days till phase 2, and you need some sort of security force there that's not the IDF, and they're not in the plan. Like, you should be not even in the beginning talks of it. You should be like in the middle of like logistics, how it's going to work, who's going to be there, and there's nobody. It's like, okay, I hope we get hostages out. I hope we get humanitarian aid there. But to think that like the IDF's going to pull out in phase 2 is madness. Because there's nobody else. Who else is going to do it? I don't think there's U.S. There's political capital even with Trump to bring U.S. troops in there.
No.
And if other countries in the Middle East aren't willing to step up, it's like, who the fuck's going to do this?
I think it's just such a problematic situation, because first of all, I mean, the only potential realistic solution would be to cobble together some of the more powerful and richer families among the Palestinians in Gaza, to oppose the rebirth of Hamas, but that's impractical. Yes, there are a lot of influential families, but they've had to collaborate with Hamas to this point simply to survive. And then putting a peacekeeping force into there is all risk and no gain, certainly as far as the Arab countries are concerned. And the Israelis aren't a peacekeeping force. They have zero credibility in that regard, and certainly among the Palestinians at this stage, and they don't want to do it. Nor will they contribute to the rebuilding Gaza. They don't subscribe to our philosophy or Colin Powell's philosophy of, if you break the China or whatever it was by the China shop, right? You've got to help rebuild
Yeah.
it. So there's simply no
$100.
one who's going to be willing to step up to the plate. And sadly, or not sadly, everyone's going to look to the United States to take leadership on this. I can't see the European Union doing this. And with the administration coming in, that's disavowed involvement in any such operation overseas. It just, yeah, there doesn't seem to be any solution at all.
Is there any political will or capital in the UN where like you can get nothing?
Well, I mean, the UN probably would have to be part of it and certainly maybe even lead it. But to Andy's point and all of our points, there's no country's going to want to Roger up to this. Certainly not us, right?
Yeah.
This is nation building, of course, because you have
Yeah.
to rebuild Gaza. But could a private company that falls under the authority and legitimacy of the UN? I mean, as a guy who tries to look for some solution, because if not, it's basically going to be a continuous cycle of violence. I think they have to look at it. The private security companies do get, bad reps, but they can serve a purpose if they're overseen correctly and if they fall under some legitimacy of an international organization like the United Nations. And if they don't do that, I don't know what the other options are, because Israel is simply not going to leave a security vacuum, which Hamas will absolutely fill immediately if they just precipitously leave. So, yeah, it's a challenge that the world should look at as one to solve, not just admire.
Right. I mean, listen, I'm happy the ceasefire is at least getting the 42 days, knock on wood, hopefully. And kids kind of stop starving in the fucking street. You know what I mean? Like where there's just basic humanitarian aid getting there and hospitals getting up and running and stuff like that. Yeah, this is a rock in the hard place. And I'm having a hard time picturing a guy like Eric Prince sending his boys in to Gaza to like start helping prop up and keep security going on. Maybe there is another person outside of Eric Prince. I hope to God that'll be able to do it if the private option was the one that got the most steam. Yeah.
I keep going back to this prisoner exchange or the exchange thing. I wouldn't put it past the Israelis to, as they're releasing these guys, to give them a wink and say, we'll see you again soon, because I don't see them just letting them go and run amok, and it's kind of like this weird cycle. It's like we let them go, they start their shit again, we capture or kill them, it starts tension, it's just this. I don't know. I just don't see these people, even if they go to other countries, I don't see them living much longer, or it just being forgiven and let go. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
No, certainly there's a history of following up by assassinating prisoners, or high-profile prisoners who have been released. But remember, there are 200. I mean, there are some 1,100 prisoners getting released, and of those, 200 serving multiple life sentences. I don't know among those how many are potential leaders, but certainly there's some high-profile names with a long resume of what they would call resistance action against the occupier, in their words, going way back to the 90s, and so yeah, and whack-a-mole works. As we found out, it works if it's combined with other efforts, right? But whack-a-mole alone has not. It has mown the grass for the Israelis. It's brought Hezbollah to its knees, but they're not out. Neither Hezbollah nor Hamas is out, and it would be a mistake to think they are. It's not. I'm trying to think of, when you think of the way we went after. God, I mean, there's so many things that we didn't do well, United States, but we did do a good job of going after Al Qaeda in Iraq, right? But it was a combined effort. and it was counterinsurgency combined with assassination and the whole intelligence cycle, and it was many more actions, and a number of those actions are what some people might call soft, but it did work for us, of course, until we withdrew and the Islamic State came in. But the point is, no, let's not undermine our own efforts. It worked well, but that's not what the Israelis do. They assassinate, and someone else moves into the position. If you look at all the lead members of Hamas, Sinwar, Daif, you name it, a position opened up for them because the Israelis killed the guy who was there before. And you very rarely get someone coming into dead man's shoes who is more benign than his predecessor, just by nature of the beast, because he knows the risks. So he's bound to be more of a zealot than the guy before.
Good point.
And I mean, like Sinwar got released in 2011, right? And he was operating for the most part. I mean, I'm sure there was some like people were tracking him and looking to smoke him, but from Mossad.
Well, yeah, and in 2014, he was the guy on the political bureau who coordinated the Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing, and directed action. And the Israelis didn't manage to get him, and then he emerged from the tunnels in 2014 afterwards to declare victory. Daif, who is kind of his right-hand man, who took over the Al-Qassam brigades, years later, and was really the guy who did a lot of the military planning for 7 October. The Israelis tried to kill him 7 times. They got his family, right? They killed his wife, his infant son, and his daughter. And that wasn't likely to make him step down and go, okay, guys, you got it. He went ahead and planned 7 October, right? So you think, again, it's an understanding of mentality. I think sometimes the Israelis forget they're dealing with human beings. You see your wife and your kids killed, all right? What's your mindset going to be? Are you going to care about killing civilians of your adversary who did that? No, of course not. And I guarantee most people who regard themselves as being compassionate human beings wouldn't think that way. You take a guy who's a jihadist anyway by background, and do that, then you're going to have trouble on your hands. And sure enough, they did, and they got Daif, eventually. But someone else took over the Al-Qassam brigades. Someone else who probably lost a lot of people during these attacks, and is probably planning something and going to be planning something as soon as Hamas gets its feet back under it. I mean, it seems to me so obvious. All this cheering every time they get someone. It's like, dudes, what else are you doing? What are you doing to consolidate your advances? Nothing. You've left a city leveled to rubble, a population that is bound to hate you. You're doing nothing to help them rebuild it. As bad as we were at times, and we made some mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan, but for the most part, we understood that a strategy cannot simply rest on killing, killing, killing. And certainly not when you're dealing with a group that not a conventional adversary with fixed lines. You're dealing with an insurgent group.
Yeah. So one quick thing before this, Netanyahu, politically, I mean, it's good that he's, it was a big push for the hostages and stuff like that, but he is starting to lose a bit of his like right flank in terms of Ben Gvir and stuff like that. Is he able to keep a coalition together enough where he's not going to get like hit with, getting booted, snap whatever election or whatever that, their system works, how their system works?
I think that, again, I'm no expert, but I think that as I mentioned, that there are Israeli politicians who are more centrist, who are willing to align themselves with Netanyahu for the sake of the ceasefire deal. So I don't think that his government is in immediate danger of falling. But that could change, if the ceasefire deal ends, depending on how it ends, or any other of a number of factors. But of course, remember, there are criminal charges against him that can only be brought when he is no longer prime minister. And so it's more than his political future at stake. It could possibly be, his way to avoid being locked up is to continue in power. And I think most people, even his supporters, will say he will do anything to stay in power. And he's a survivor. He's the longest serving Israeli prime minister, period, longer than Ben-Gurion. And he's been a lead player in Israeli politics since the early 90s.
And it's the phase 2 negotiations. I think they start next week. Next week, that could be the biggest challenge to that. If he agrees with it, he's going to have to really explain what we already talked about. How do we ensure that Hamas doesn't take back over and become the threat that they once were before October 7th?
I mean, you could see how hard these negotiations were, right? The two sides that fucking hate each other, where it's like this phase 2 thing should have been planned for months ago. It should have been part of the initial ceasefire in terms of like, how is it going to work? Who's going to be there? The actual nuts and bolts of it. But at least there's
Netanyahu always, I'm sorry. No, Netanyahu always said, he took a stand on the requirement for the Israelis to withdraw from Gaza, right? And even when the military said, "Hey, we can go down to the Philadelphia corridor and still be ready to respond from there," and Halevi, who was the chief of staff, said publicly, as did oh gosh,
Gallant.
yeah, Gallant, right? They both said that, and they were both fired. And so, that was the way that he kept slow rolling the ceasefire. Even when his own generals said, "Hey, those terms are acceptable," he found a way to they weren't.
It might have been just a strategy when it comes to negotiation, that if they would have talked too much about phase 2, they would have been wrapped around the axle on phase 2 and never even gotten to phase 1.
Yeah. All right, so cautious optimism, man. I hope they keep bringing that humanitarian aid in, because I'm not interested in like little kids fucking starving in the street. It's a bummer. Yeah. And Mick is, involved in that humanitarian effort with Fogbo. You could check it out. The link is in the description. There's some other stuff too about the TikTok ban and stuff like that, but we could do that on another time. This is awesome. All right, so Mick's companies, Fogbo, Longbow, everything is in the description. Check that out. Andy Milburn, he's got a great book, When the Tempest Gathers. Link is in the description. Find him. If you want to talk to Andy Milburn, maybe he'll answer you. The links are in the description. Stop asking me. Jason Lyons, same thing. Links are in the description as well. And the best place to support the show is patreon.com/theteamhouse. I missed you guys. It's been a week, an entire week. I haven't seen you guys. Yeah, great show, guys. If there's anything else you guys want to add, please feel free.
No, good.
Good seeing you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh, yeah, thanks, everyone. Take it.